Welcome. We're continuing our conversation about rhetorical methods, looking at the new rhetoric. This is the third installment on the new rhetoric and the final installment. What we're looking at today is the issue of audience. Audience is the key concept in the new rhetoric. This is the linchpin. This is the thing that, another metaphor, this is the thing that stitches it all together. So the ideas that we've encountered so far, they will they'll snap in place if we can get the idea of audience down clearly in our mind. Now, you will remember that just like Perelman had started on a search for justice. He wanted to find a pragmatic, a practical way of approaching everyday decisions, because people were making decisions all the time, and those decisions, as of course he had seen, were sometimes horribly filled with moral consequences. And so both Toulmin and Perelman, in both methods, they come out of this attempt to try and reconnect the idea of human reasoning and human rationality to those value judgments, which are made every day by people in all circumstances of life, both the morality of war and just whether or not you're going to cut somebody off in line in the coffee shop, right? I mean, it's the whole scope of everyday human experiences. That's what they are interested in. For Perelman especially, that is very directly focused on the concept of justice. He is looking for a way to tie human reason to a viable discourse about justice that doesn't leave us trapped in a world of just private opinion and made up definitions out of our own little group, right? Because he had seen that ends up really badly most of the time. All right. So that's where he's going. He's looking for that idea of justice. And he does this by redeveloping that concept of adherence that's rooted in the idea of conviction. He wants to focus on that. Adherence is his idea, his terminology for this idea that you have embraced a certain thing as a conviction, meaning you've given adherence to it. You can't absolutely prove it, but boy, you got some backing here to help you along, and that will allow you to embrace this idea. So that's where he starts. But the central idea that's going to hold all this together and that is going to, in fact, open it up for us will be the idea of audience. So we're turning our attention to audience, and we have to begin with two basic ideas of audience that we're going to find in the new rhetoric. They are the same and they are different, okay? And you have to keep them both thought of as a single unit, and you have to be able to deal with the two ideas of audience separately. So it gets a little tricky, but it's not that bad. You'll get a sense of how to do it. He names these two audiences, and we can talk about them as sort of different things, even though they share a lot of space. He names these two things the universal audience and the particular audience. Now, the universal audience, the particular audience, very briefly, the universal audience is a set. He calls it the ensemble of everybody who is willing and able to discuss the matter at hand. So essentially, it's a group of all sane, rational, reasonable human beings. The particular audience is different. The particular audience is the set of those people that this particular rhetor is attempting to influence with this particular artifact that you're looking at as a critic, right? So the rhetor is giving a speech, or they designed a commercial, or they built a building, or they painted a picture. They did something that was designed to produce adherence, to encourage conviction in a group of people. And that particular artifact was targeting somebody. That's the particular audience. So the particular audience is the set of those that the rhetor's trying to influence, if you will. I mean, it's not all persuasion, but to strengthen or to create new convictions. The group that's being targeted basically is the particular audience. So when we talk about the set of the universal audience, we're talking about everybody who, as we said, is willing and able to discuss this. That's a big set, okay? That's the group of all the human beings on the planet who are, reasonable, who are connected to reality, who can think clearly, who can stitch a couple of ideas together and make sense out of the world. This is the vast majority of human beings, right? So people are members of the universal audience because they can think clearly. because they're connected to reality, because they see and respond to the world around them in a proper and appropriate way. If my beloved is headed out the door, right, and I call after her and I say, hey, don't forget to get a gallon of milk on your way home. My beloved does not turn to me and say, well, parakeets can't smoke cigars. Why? Why doesn't she turn to me and say something like that? Why? Because she's a member of the universal audience. She thinks clearly, she can make connections. She's not severed from reality. She understands discourse and the possibility of discourse. That's the universal audience. It's the ensemble of everybody who is able and who's willing. Both of those are, you got to have both, able and willing to engage in reasonable discourse about the matter at hand. Okay. Now, that's different from the particular. The particular is a group of people that are being targeted by the rhetor in this specific moment. Now, the rhetor is therefore sort of picking a particular audience out of the universal audience. Okay, so the universal audience is out there, and the rhetor is choosing members of the particular audience from that universal group. Now, we're going to walk that back in just a minute, okay? But that's kind of the place to start thinking. What makes a particular audience a particular audience? Well, they share some view, some characteristic, some quality, usually rooted in some kind of value or belief system. That's usually what makes up the particular audience, okay? Now, don't get the idea that somehow the universal audience is good and the particular audience is bad. That's not what we're doing at all, and it's not at all what Perelman is trying to construct. So that's not the kind of judgment or interpretation or analysis that we're looking for. So it's not like one of them's good and one of them's bad. It's they're both out there and they both function. The particular audience is linked because they have a shared set of views or beliefs. So when a sports figure is talking to fans of their own team, right? That's a particular audience. That's a group that you can bet share certain characteristics, qualities, beliefs, hopes, desires, values. Okay, that's the kind of thing that constitutes a particular audience. When a religious authority, a priest or an imam or a rabbi, they stand up and they speak to the people who share their faith in a religious service. That's a particular audience. When a politician stands up and talks not to the country at large or to everybody in their state, but to their own party, that's a particular audience. Now, if they turn their attention from the particular audience of my party and they begin to talk to everybody who's in my congressional district, that's another particular audience, okay? So it's not like particular audiences are bad. They're no rhetor ever addresses only the universal audience. Rhetors are constantly addressing particular audiences. That's where the nuts and bolts are. That's where the particular, the specific, the rubber meets the road kind of discourse goes on. And we're not trying to suggest that's a problem. In fact, Perelman says over and over again, that's exactly proper. It's exactly right that you should speak to a particular audience over and over again. However, there are a couple of things that we want to call our attention to here. What this means, so this thought about the particular audience, it means that that particular audience has been chosen. They've been picked. They've been, in a way, constructed inside the mind of the rhetor. So the rhetor is actually choosing the particular audience. The rhetor has decided who he or she wants to address, okay? The rhetor is addressing a particular audience. A particular audience is particular. It's a specific group because they share some value or belief that binds them together. So now think back to our lesson on adherence. Remember, in adherence, you got to start with something the audience already agrees with, embraces, has given adherence to. That's where you start. So it may be that that particular audience tells you from the beginning who the rhetor is, or what the rhetor is planning to use to make their case. It may be that the rhetor is planning to appeal to that very defining characteristic in order to move this audience along. Because, of course, as we remember from adherence, only by beginning with an already accepted conviction can you create new conviction. All right. But since that conviction is shared, and since the rhetor built that conviction, that rhetor built that audience. That's going to be really valuable and important to us. Okay. The rhetor built the audience. Now, here's the thing, though, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky. And I said we're going to walk back some of this in just a second. Well, here we're walking backwards. What we just said about the particular audience, it's constructed in the rhetor's mind. And I don't mean constructed as in built out of nothing, but I mean it's assembled. It's put together out of what the rhetor expects to be able to accomplish in this setting, and what the rhetor expects is going to happen out there. Okay, while it is true that the particular audience is constructed in the rhetor's mind, it is equally true that the universal audience is constructed in the rhetor's mind. Okay, hold on. I thought the universal audience was everybody who could be reasonable about the matter we're talking about. Yep, that's exactly right. But every rhetor has their own idea of what is going to count as reasonable in this discussion, and they don't always line up. Now, it's fair to say enormous overlap. Yeah. Enormous overlap, but not identical. My idea of the group of people who are reasonable and are going to be able to talk about this won't match your idea. So if we're talking about, the best linebacker in the NFL, okay, the group of people who can have that conversation in my mind might be different from the group of people who could have that conversation in your mind. If we're talking about anything, we might have different ideas about people who are able and willing to discuss it. Now, where do we get those ideas? We get those ideas because we have these piecemeal bits and sharp angles of experience that fall across our lives in different times and in different ways, and that lead us to start drawing perimeters around, who counts as a reasonable person and who isn't a reasonable person, who isn't to be trusted, who can't really put it all together the way they should. And so I'm building, through my own experiences, these sharp edges of my own experiences, I'm building an imperfect, let's all be very clear here, our view of the universal audience, it is very uniquely ours, but it is always imperfect. The universal audience, like the particular audience, is being crafted in the mind of the rhetor. That's intriguing. And it also tells us something. Since the rhetor is building the universal audience and they're choosing members of the particular audience, it means some members of that particular audience are probably going to fall outside the border of the universal audience. In other words, every rhetor is going to be addressing a particular audience where they think there are people in this group that won't be able to get it, won't be able to follow, won't be able to do this, or aren't willing, right? Who don't want to, who are going to try to undermine this message. So a rhetor is facing a particular audience where some members are in the universal audience and other members may not be. So we've got two audiences now, okay? And both of those audiences, the particular and the universal audience, they're both reflections of the rhetor's understanding of this moment. Who's reasonable and who I'm addressing, all right? Now, that means if we could get a way to assess the rhetor's view of the audiences, their universal and their particular audience, if we could learn that, then we would learn a great deal about how this message is being crafted by this rhetor to work. What does this rhetor think will work? What does this rhetor think will not work? That's the issue. And that's where we as critics will begin to make some use of this idea of the audience. All right. So with these distinctions in mind, the universal and the particular audience, with that in mind, we're ready to start looking at the critic's job, which is to make some, to try and give some solid answers to some basic questions. So as a beginning critic using this method, you can ask 3 questions that are going to help you understand and interpret the artifact. Question 1, what is it that this rhetor is view? How does this rhetor view the universal audience? What does it look like? And is it healthy? Okay. What does the rhetor think the universal audience is? That's the baseline. Now, let's look at that. How do you figure that out? What tells you what the rhetor's idea of the universal audience is? What tells you what the rhetor's universal audience looks like? Okay, that's where we're going to step back to the world of adherence. Because when we look at the way the rhetor is crafting adherence, that tells us about the universal audience. The New Rhetoric is very clear. We divided this idea of adherence into the real and the preferable. Remember that discussion? All right, last time we talked about that. Okay, here is where we're going to bring that forward into the present discussion. The real, facts, truths, presumptions, those things, they are the kinds of appeals that are made to the universal audience, not the particular audience. Okay. Now, they can be used in a particular setting. They can be used with a particular audience, but they hint at, they show us they show us critics, what the rhetor is thinking of in terms of the universal audience. So we pay really special attention to the use of the real, the facts, the truths, the presumptions, because those show the rhetor's idea of the universal audience. We ask, for example, what does this rhetor consider facts to be? Where does this rhetor think facts come from? What are the rules for challenging facts? Does the rhetor think that facts are rooted in feelings? That's a very strange and dangerous place if we're going to start there. If you think facts are rooted in the way I feel, okay, that's going to raise some questions, right? Where does the rhetor get their definition that's going to define facts? Okay, so those are the kinds of things we begin to look at. When a rhetor forwards something that they are handling as a fact, now go back to adherence, check your definition of facts and adherence. When a rhetor forwards something as an appeal that appears to be a fact, you as a critic need to look really carefully at that and ask some of those tough questions about it, all right? What about truths? Remember, truths are systems that makes sense out of all the facts. We get a million facts out here. We have to connect them and see how they're related to each other, right? Okay, so that's what truths means to Perelman. Not truth with a capital T, but truths are systems through which we understand how the realities around us are related. Okay, so how does the rhetor think you make sense out of the facts? What is their system of understanding? What systems of understanding do they say you're supposed to apply to facts in order to make sense out of them? That's the kind of question we raise and ask as we look at the appeals the rhetor is making. We comb through the appeals the rhetor makes, the reasons they give for shifting your adherence over to a new idea. We look at those and we focus on, what do they say is true? What do they say the facts are? How do they say the systems are related? And presumptions, okay? What does the rhetor presume about the world? What is in the duh category? What do they say that is a throwaway, that's just obvious, that they obviously think nobody could disagree with that. That's just, well, okay. What's there? What's in that category? That tells you who the rhetor has put into their definition of the universal audience. Now, you got to be careful here. So go back, look at the discussion about adherence, bring that information here to understand what's going on here. But the thing that I would tell you to be careful about is this. The critic is not at this point out fishing for some kind of a takedown, okay? You're not you're not looking at what the rhetor says are the truths in order to point out how stupid the rhetor is. Okay, so for example, you have to, as a critic, you have to grapple with these facts, truths, and presumptions in a way that you can present them fairly and as clearly and correctly as you can. You want to present them in a way that the rhetor would look at that and say, yeah, that's exactly what I believe. Okay, that's exactly how I see the world. That's your goal. You're not looking to start a fight. This isn't what you're doing in this critical step. Think of, for example, an atheist who is looking at the facts that are present, and when they get to this idea of, okay, how is this rhetor saying that the particular audience should make sense out of this, because that's going to tell me who they think the universal audience is, right? What is the system that they're appealing to here? Oh, it's religious. Well, as an atheist, I don't believe there is any religion, so clearly this is a failed message. This is a stupid rhetor. No, you don't get to, that's not what you get to do. And of course you can invert it. A religious person doesn't get to look at a presentation and say, well, you didn't bring God in, so clearly this isn't worth listening to. That's not the goal. The question here is, as a critic, you're looking to see, does the rhetor present truth, a system for understanding and interpreting the world to their audience? Did they present that to the audience in a way that opens up the possibility for discourse? Okay, does a rhetor have a system that can allow us to continue to exchange ideas even when we recognize we disagree? Because obviously we're going to disagree. That, I mean, the universal audience, hold in mind, the universal audience in no way assumes there is universal agreement. It assumes a universal willingness and ability to talk about our agreements and our disagreements, okay? And to sort of carry on discourse about those. That's the goal. So that's what you're looking for. Does the rhetor deal with their truths, their systems for understanding the world, in a way that is still open and would allow other people to step in even when they disagree? Step in and have a discourse? Or do they deal with their truths in a way that sort of narrows that? Okay, that's the kind of question we're up against. So question number one, what does the rhetor think the universal audience looks like? Not surprisingly, when we move on then to question number two. Question number two is pretty clear. Who's the particular audience in this case? In this case, who has the rhetor specifically chosen? Who have they placed into their mind as the people that this particular message is targeting? Okay, how do you find that out? Oh, you do exactly the same thing. You go to the appeals that we talked about. You look at what the calls for adherence are, and here we pay special attention to appeals to preference, the common ground appeals that make up particular audiences. Values, hierarchies, and loci, that's where we go. And we do exactly the same thing. What kind of values are being tapped into? What are the priorities of those values? What's put ahead of what? That tells you who the specific audience is that is supposed to be here. So what is the particular audience in this case? Well, that's the audience that is going to be tied into those values, those priorities, and so forth. So we ask that, what values are appealed to? How are those values prioritized? What kind of maxims or presumed moral or ethical or social spaces are present in the message? That's the question. The particular audience is hidden in there, and the critic needs to listen, to watch carefully for the kinds of appeals that appear, and to ferret out whether or not there are adherences being invited through preference or through real, and the reality or preference. And there'll be both. The answer is they're going to be both, but they're going to tell you about different ideas of audience that the rhetor is carrying in their head. Those kinds of invitations to adherence that rest in reality, they tell you about the universal audience. The kinds of invitations to adherence that rest in preference, they tell you about the particular audience. So you need to know both of those, because when we get to question three, not surprisingly, we move pretty quickly and directly into this idea of, all right, How does the rhetor see the relationship between the universal and the particular audience? What is the relationship that is present in this rhetor's mind? And this is the pay dirt, okay? It's this idea of relationship that is going to tell us the most. And this is what we as critics are going to get more of than anything else. So we've seen these two audiences. Both of them are reflections of the rhetor's understanding. Now we want to see how the rhetor moves back and forth between them. We want to see how the rhetor is thinking these two groups are related. What does he or she, the rhetor, what does he or she encourage that relationship to be? That's the question. Now, to think about this, we're going to go back to our universal and particular audience. Let's change our view just a bit here, okay? Because we can see this maybe with a bit of a Venn diagram, a little bit more specifically. So if we think about the universal and the particular audience in this way, we will begin to see them in relationship to each other in terms of overlap and motion, all right? Another perspective that we can take here as we begin to talk about the universal and the particular audience, remember, we can ask this too. How are the appeals to preference, which tell us about the particular audience, related to the appeals to the real, which tell us about the universal audience? Okay, so that's the question. How are these related? And it's not a simple answer like, you know, they're more of one kind than the other. It's not that simple. We want to see how they're related in a way in this message that pulls the audience in one direction or another, the particular audience in one direction or another. We know that in the universal audience, you're dealing with facts, truths, and presumptions. We know that in the particular audience, you're looking at values, hierarchies, and loci. Okay, we got that. Now we want to see the way the rhetor has built those kinds of appeals. Which way is that tugging the particular audience? Now, before we do that, there's one little thing we want to look at here. Remember, we said there are always some members of the particular audience that are just a little outside the scope of the universal audience. Well, some really are. Some of them are so far, you know, they have edged, they've broken the boundary, or at least cracked it seriously, and they're in a space where they really are not willing, or they're not able to have a genuine exchange of ideas. They can't do it, or they won't do it. Those people we call fanatics, or sometimes we refer to them as skeptics, depending on the situation. We're going to be back to that concept of the fanatical and the skeptic. The new rhetoric is going to give us a way to think about those and a way to understand those and at one level reply to them. But we're going to get there in a minute. First, we got to go back to this relationship between the universal and the particular audience. So how's the rhetor handling, encouraging the relationship? What does the rhetor seem to endorse as the proper relationship between those two audiences? That's what you, the critic, are trying to find out. If you're using this method, what you're after is you're trying to figure out, what does the rhetor encourage or endorse as the proper relationship between the particular and the universal audience? That's your $64,000 question. Okay. There are a few things that might creep up. So as you begin to look at it, you might discover, as you compare this and you listen to the kinds of appeals that are present, you might discover that some aspects of this, you might find certain messages that are characterized by a tug into the universal audience. Okay. The appeals that you watch, even when they're addressed in terms of values and priorities to the particular audience, to identify who they are, they're still couched in a way that sort of champions, acknowledges, shows respect for the universal audience. So you have the kinds of appeals that even when they're occurring in a particular space are tugging the particular audience a little more into the boundaries of the universal audience. All right. So look at the appeals. How do you recognize that? Okay, so pragmatically, what are you looking for? You gather the appeals. You look at all those appeals that are present. Think back to the last lesson we did. You look at all the appeals and you look at how they're mixed up and mingled. And you ask yourself, are these coming together in a way that champions, that praises, that encourages the acceptance of reality? Are there argument structures that pull the audience into the status of a universal audience? In other words, because of the assumptions they make, right? Are there argument structures that make certain assumptions that encourage the audience to the particular audience to move into a status and change their status and become more robust members of the universal audience? That's what you want to point out. Find those things, those appeals that call the particular audience to respect, champion, accept, embrace universal qualities, facts, truth, presumptions, those things. That's what you're pointing out to make the case that here's a message that is pulling the particular audience into a more universal status. On the other hand, of course, you can see tensions that'll happen in the other direction, right? You can see tensions, you'll watch, and you will see a pull that draws the particular audience out of the universal audience. It pulls the audience toward a more particular status, okay? Again, how do you find it? Same thing. Go to the appeals. Look at how they're mixed and mingled. And are they mixed and mingled in a way that champions, that praises, that encourages the acceptance of the preference above the real? Point those out, okay? Are values and hierarchies set in contrast to facts and truths and made more important? Okay, that's the kind of appeal that's pulling an audience away from, pulling a particular audience away from universal status. Okay, values and hierarchies set in contrast to the universal status, that's the danger. That's one of the things that you are able to point out, and when you point it out, you're able to make a judgment about it, right? There's a third place that we can point out where we can say the rhetor is in fact off the deep end, okay? The rhetor might be engaged in warning against, in denying the sorts of appeals that are rooted in universal status, where, you know, the particular things that define us, they matter more than any of that fact, any more than you know, our system of understanding the world, our hierarchies, they're more important than any system that can explain a whole lot more of the world. They're the universal audience, they're the enemy. And in cases like that, and we're talking here about extreme cases, this is cult status stuff. In those situations, the rhetor will be trying to build a wall that severs and separates the particular audience from the universal audience and define the particular audience as the only set of beliefs, values, facts, anything that matters. Okay, so the universal audience is discounted and the particular audience is treated as if it were the only thing that mattered. Okay, so those are your three basic options, okay? Option one, the rhetor assumes that the particular audience is strongly rooted in the universal audience, will respond to universal appeals. They will expect their own particular views to be coherent, to match up with the universal audience, even when they're not universally accepted. Right, so the view that I have of religion, no question, it's not universally accepted, but it's coherent and it's part of the universal conversation. We're not, you know, afraid of this or discounting it. My political convictions, certainly not accepted by everyone, but they're rooted in the facts and the systems that make up and make sense out of the world in a democratic society. So that's the kind of thing that you get in relationship one. Particular audience rooted in the universal audience. Relationship two, the particular audience is being called away from the universal audience. They're being herded at one level, sort of encouraged to step away from universal status. Appeals in this situation set preference above reality. They draw the particular audience out from and away from the universal audience. And of course, third, we see situations where there is a severance and the particular audience is simply broken off from the universal audience and treated as an entirely different reality and the only reality that matters. That sort of fanatical vision of the world is present in this third example of how particular and universal audiences can be related. And that brings us really to this idea of fanaticism. Let's think about the fanatical here for a moment, because the new rhetoric is very clear about fanaticism. You're looking now at a chart that you're quite familiar with, I hope. By this time, you know that there are sort of three aspects of the human intellectual experience. There's at the top, there's just things we know, and nobody can disagree with that. No reasonable person can disagree with that. It's just knowledge. We know that. In the middle, there are things we believe. We hold them to be true. We have really good reasons to back them up. And, those reasons are built out of that entire system of enthymematic reflection. Good reasons to back them up. There are convictions, the things we have given adherence to in the new rhetoric terminology. And then at the bottom, there's just your feelings. You happen, I want, I like. It's just animal level grunts and points. That's all you got at the bottom, right? We've said that at the bottom, nobody cares about those things unless they're, that you have some kind of deep relationship with them, right? You don't care whether, you couldn't care less what my thoughts are about Brussels sprouts, okay? But my beloved, she cares, okay? Well, that's nice and it's great. But my feelings about Brussels sprouts have absolutely no impact on your life whatsoever. And that is what brings us to fanaticism. Believe it or not, Brussels sprouts and my life. Okay, fanaticism is a situation, the new rhetoric says, where the fanatic is consistently looking at evidence that should lead to one of these three levels. I want that. I like that. Well, that leads to an understanding of your own feelings. I have a set of good reasons that back this up, but I can't prove it. That leads to belief. Here is a system of scientific mathematical proof that nobody's going to be able to object to if they understand it. That leads to knowledge. Okay, the fanatic is consistently picking up evidence that would lead to one of those levels, and they're promoting it. So in other words, the fanatic treats their private experience, their personal feelings, as evidence that you should do something. They treat their private feelings, their reflections, their private experiences, they treat that as a reason for someone else that they don't have any real connection to, no real relationship with. They treat their private feelings as reasons that strangers should embrace some idea. In other words, they take the sorts of things that lead to personal feeling, and they treat the evidence that leads to personal feeling as if it were capable of leading to your convictions. Okay, that promotes the conclusion above the evidence. Now, not surprisingly, they do exactly the same thing at the next level, right? If they have a set of good reasons, they treat those as if it absolutely closes the case. Well, nobody could disagree now. There's no way anybody could object now that they've seen how thoroughly I have presented my good reasons. Okay, so they treat the kind of evidence that should lead to conviction, they treat that as if it should lead to knowledge. That's fanaticism. Fanaticism is consistently promoting conclusions above the weight of the evidence. Now, if that's a fanatic, you don't have to be Einstein to figure out what a skeptic is, right? A skeptic is going to do exactly the opposite. The skeptic is consistently demoting conclusions below the evidence. Now, usually you find these two happening in sync, right? If I'm a fanatic about something, I tend to be a skeptic about anyone who disagrees with me. The skeptic works by saying, you can present absolute proof to them of something, and they say, well, I can see how you would draw that conclusion. They look at absolute proof and they treat it as if it were just leading to a private, a personal conviction. Okay. And if you present just a personal conviction, you will almost inevitably be told, yeah, well, that's just your feelings. So they're constantly demoting conclusions. Now, that's a head full right there. All right. And it's one of the really intriguing aspects, particularly in this day and age, inside the new rhetoric. So there's nothing here that's hard. It's not complicated. You know this system, knowledge, belief, personal feeling and desire. We've talked about that for weeks. You understand how those are related to each other. And so this schema here showing the fanatic and the skeptic, there's nothing confusing about it, but wrapping your mind around it takes a little time. So spend some time with that and make sure that you You understand it. Okay, let's sum it up. Close it down. Here's where we are. You know that adherence is one of the key terms in terms of the rhetoric, and you know that basically you get to adherence by looking at reality and preference in the technical term that the New Rhetoric uses it. You know that reality is based in facts, truths, and presumptions as they're defined in the New Rhetoric. You know preference is rooted in values, hierarchies, and loci as defined in the New Rhetoric. You know that no rhetor ever addresses an audience that's a blank slate. All audiences have already given their adherence to some aspect of the world, right? They've got convictions. They come to the rhetor with already established convictions. And the rhetor's job is to give presence to some of those things they have already given their adherence to. So they have adherence, they have convictions, and they're rooted. Those convictions are rooted in their understanding of truth, the presumptions they've made about the world, certain facts that they understand, hierarchies that they've been given, values, loci. They've been dipping into that in order to make their convictions. The rhetor's job is to focus in on some things that this particular audience has already chosen to embrace. They've already given adherence to those things, and call their attention to it, to give presence. That's what the term means in the New Rhetoric, to give presence to things the audience already believes and has already concluded. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by, stylistic devices, by the way you organize your material, by images, by just simply pointing it out, saying, we all know, we all believe, by argument structures. Remember the discussion about argument structures? It's one of the key ways to call an audience's attention to something, to give presence to something. That's how you do it. Why? Well, because there's a new thesis out there. And what you want to do is you want to take the adherence that the audience has already given to things, the convictions they've already got, and you want to show them how that conviction, that set of convictions, leads to the new thesis. That's the system. Now look at that carefully. That's the system in the New Rhetoric, okay? The new system is you give presence to something. That's how you transfer adherences that are already present over to the new thesis. That's analysis. That is what you do in analysis. The analytical step when you are using the New Rhetoric is there, right there in front of you. You look at what has been given presence through these various devices, you point it out, you show the argument structures, you tap into the kinds of appeals then that are built out of those, and you show how that leads to the new thesis. It's not radically different from the classical model where you name a rhetorical device, show how it, define it, show how it functions in this particular aspect and get you to the new thesis. Well, you're doing that, but you're doing it on a larger system now, okay? You're tapping into the rhetor's processes. That's analysis. Okay, if that's analysis, if your analysis is going to say, the rhetor gave presence to these ideas show the audience has already had convictions here, here, and here. And by calling attention to those three convictions, the rhetor has brought on the possibility for the audience to embrace the new thesis. Okay, that's what you're doing in analysis. If that's analysis, what happens in interpretation? In interpretation, we unpack what it was the rhetor tapped into in order to understand the rhetor's views of the audiences they're dealing with. And we interpret the process they went through in order to show us what kind of a relationship this rhetor is encouraging in their rhetoric. Is this rhetor encouraging their particular audience not to leave their beliefs or weaken their convictions, but to understand their convictions in the context of a larger conversation where others who will disagree with them are also participating. Is that what's going on? That's one option. Or is the rhetor talking about the particular audience's identification, the qualities and values and hierarchies that identify them, in a way that sort of pull them away from that suggests they shouldn't be giving attention to those universal qualities of facts, truths, and presumptions? Or, worse yet, are you looking at a rhetor who is severing the relationship between the particular audience and the universal audience entirely? Are they saying that is to be rejected? That's your interpretation. You get your interpretation by looking at the way appeals are done. And those appeals are what you're doing in your analysis. Okay. So that's the new rhetoric. So if we think of the new rhetoric, that's how we do it. As a beginning critic, that's how you open it up. That's how you unpack it. You do that kind of analysis that looks at the appeals, and then you move on to see how is the universal audience and the particular audience related in these kinds of appeals. That's analysis, that's interpretation. And that is an introduction to the new rhetoric.